Welcome to Inspiration Radio, Growth Principles for Humanity and Progress. Join us when we share information, wisdom, and ideas how to create an extraordinary future for us all. The future is open. We together decide what will be in it. Two beliefs you forever need to eliminate. Get it out of your head. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Or, if you're growing older, you need to accept that your body is not, like a young person, everything is going down. I just turned 72, and my fitness level is increasing. And I'm building new synapses in my brain. Because these two sentences are not right. We know better today. You can learn whenever you want. It depends on you if your brain builds new synapses. And if you have the right mindset and train also the brain and your body, you can stay fit longer than ever thought. Today I talk with Dr. Andrew Hill. He has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and he is the founder and CEO of Peak Brain Institute. So I think it's a must to listen it and listen the full hour, because there are a lot of information you can use to get to a personal peak in quality of life, in the way you think, the way you really live. There's so much more what we know today, modern science, modern technology. You can get rid of a lot of problems, patterns, trauma, even health issues, and you can tune yourself. I use here an example. Okay, maybe in the past I didn't use my car right, and I know I could fix a car, but we know also we can tune cars. And if you see the body like this, and we can do it via the brain. And Dr. Andrew Hill knows how to help and how to tune. So listen carefully. You can visit the Institute via website and be then just on Zoom and learn and train, or you go to one of their centers. But first, listen, ideally get some ahas, and start changing your life. There is so much easier ways to live a totally different potential, what we all have. Good morning, Andrew, from Switzerland. Good morning to LA, which is in LA, it's morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I know
Nice to be here today.
7 o'clock your time, so you go up early. And
Yep.
it comes directly the first question. Is it important to go up early for the brain? Or is it
I
just...
think it is. I think it is. I'm not a big proponent of this idea that we have chronotypes. I think the chronotype myth, the idea that we have larks and owls, and people that are better at staying up late or getting up early, I don't really believe that. In all my experience, I think that humans do really well when they train strongly to the outside world, when the brain knows what time of day it is, whether or not you're up at night or you're up super early. If the brain doesn't know what time of day it is, then your circadian rhythm starts to slide past the Earth's circadian rhythm, or the photoperiod. So the strongest cues for circadian entrainment are when you eat, morning light, and morning activity. So the morning has a very strong flavor, a strong entrainer for what time of day it is. And most of the cues that we hear strongly from the outside world are in the morning. So if you get up super early and train well with the sun, my experience is both personally and working with people is that the amount of sleep you need to get goes down and the quality goes up. So
Oh.
the time to sleep in is the start of the night, folks, not the end of the night. So go to bed early, no
Hmm.
shame. So
So when I have this ring here, or
yeah,
I'm always complaining,
yes,
oh, last night you was an hour later than your middle of your rhythm, so that's not. And when I'm in Sweden and there is not really a sunset,
yeah.
uh, so would you say then I don't need less or so much sleep?
Well, in if you're going to be in some place where the sun is up, 10, 20, 30 hours, most of the day,
Hmm.
I think then the timing of your food becomes relatively critical because the brain's not going to get a lot of evening light or morning light difference. So it's not going to really understand the morning reset. So fasting before bed becomes the critical aspect of circadian management because as melatonin gets released, which should happen later in the day, it
Hmm.
suppresses release of insulin from the pancreas completely. So you have this falling insulin signal as melatonin goes up, and that creates this desire to snack. Because if you have insulin to release, ooh, maybe this food around evolutionarily, you better store it. But in this modern world where we have tons of access to calories all the time,
Yeah.
that falling insulin signal creates snacky behavior at the end of the day. And that actually pushes circadian rhythm back by several hours.
Mhm.
So if you go to bed with some high blood sugar, essentially, or anything above low blood sugar, then it suppresses your growth hormone release. And for those people that are north of about 35 or 40, you only get one small pulse of growth hormone after you fall asleep, middle of the night, unless you have high blood sugar or any blood sugar. And then it suppresses the
Hmm.
release of growth hormone. So eat before bed, wake up tired and hungry, but go to bed a little bit hungry and wake up full of energy and feeling lean. So it's kind of paradoxical, but fasting before bed is among I believe it's the strongest exogenous cue, the strongest cue from the outside world about circadian information. And food timing is a stronger cue than light, than sleep, than anything else. So the number one thing you should do for managing your circadian rhythm is eat in the time zone you want to live in. And you can use this for travel too. You can pick a time zone that's a few hours away and a few days before start changing meal timing to approximate that of
Just.
the
Mhm.
time zone. And you will have very little time zone adjustment across multiple hours that way. So it's a nice little trick as well.
But here comes the question, what is in the culture and everything? And when you said just fasting before sleep, so what is
Yeah.
the definition then for fasting? How many hours?
Yeah. It depends a little bit on how healthy your ability to clear insulin, clear blood sugar.
Hmm.
But I would say if you're not metabolically, dramatically off,
Hmm.
then 2 hours is probably fine, maybe three. If you're a
Hmm.
child, two. If you're somebody who's insulin resistant and overweight and craves carbs all the time, maybe six. You might need to actually have a time restricted feeding window that allows a really big drop of insulin at the end of the day so that you can start actually having a bit of a, insulin reset. Because cortisol, insulin, melatonin, these things all sort of cycle in a circadian way, not just in response to what we eat. So you have to kind of think about both as you manage the body and brain.
And how is it the culture? Like in Europe, there is Spain, and I experienced the restaurants where they open
Sure.
early, but 10 o'clock in the evening, then it's
Absolutely.
full and the kids are alive there. So they have a totally different rhythm and not looking
Yeah,
for.
but at 10 o'clock in Madrid or something in the summer, it's still light at 10 o'clock at night. It's still the sun's just gone down, really, right?
Mhm.
So I think in that instance, the food timing is sort of, people don't eat at 10 p.m. and go right to bed in Spain. They probably, and they also don't have a, American style food dinner, which is lots of calories in 20 minutes,
Mhm.
highly processed, and then crawl into bed, which is the Western
Okay.
sort
Yeah,
of,
they take more time. It's more a celebration.
yeah, 2, 3 hours of dinner, having relaxing time, have a good hour afterwards, sitting and talking, maybe go for a
Mhm.
walk. This is the benefit of the French paradox, in spite of all the high fat and smoking, apparently because they walk everywhere, it seems to offset a lot of the risk. So I think that the sort of Iberian cultures that stay up very late, that have late evenings, that have late dinners, they have an adjustment. They're not eating four meals and the last one's at 10 p.m. They're having, sort of a circadian appropriate, if you will, lifestyle.
Yeah.
But Humans are pretty adaptable. This is why I don't believe in larks versus owls or chronotypes, because you put any human pretty much in any environment, give them a little bit of circadian support, and they can shift into night shift, day shift, working late,
Hmm.
getting up early. So I do feel that people that complain that they must, stay
Hmm.
up late, it's because they're not well entrained. And the
Yeah.
human brain and body can exceed the 24-hour photo period pretty easily. We have a hard time if our circadian rhythm is short, but we tend to be sloppy. It tends to be longer than the day because a negative entrainment, shortening something, is a way to create entrainment or oscillation. So if our own circadian rhythm is slightly longer than 24 hours, but the sunlight and the food and the activity signal comes in shorter than 24 hours, it's a very strong entrainment to yank us back into that cycling.
Hmm.
So this is why we can't catch up on sleep by sleeping in, but we can catch up on sleep by going to bed early.
Oh,
It's the negative entrainment that resets the circadian rhythm. So,
yeah. And the deep sleep phase. But that's so interesting. And that's in the last sentence you mentioned the brain can adjust. But when we talk about food, at least I grow up with food, has just to do with the body. So
mm,
eating, fasting is just about the body and not the connection of the brain. But uh, you are not the Sleep Institute, you're from the Peak Brain Institute. So
right.
what is the connection then between the food or, like you said, the rhythm and the brain?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of sort of neuro gut coupling. And, the largest nerves in the body that have the most heavy bundle is the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve that runs from the brain to the heart to the gut. About 10% of it, most of it runs up. It runs from the gut to the heart to the brain. And of course, the heart is integrating moment to moment to decide if you need to run away or digest food or relax. And that heart tone, the thing that our ring picks up overnight, the HRV, that's the moment to moment integration of the ascending information from the gut and the descending information from the brain. So the heart kind of balance that place between sympathetic activation and parasympathetic relaxation. And the gut's heavily involved in that. If you're stressed, if your body decides, your brain decides you need to run away, you stop digesting. And if you are digesting, then you have less mental energy for activating your mind. So the uh, the 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 gut tends to have a very strong support on. Sorry, my camera's acting up. So the gut tends to have a very strong regulation support with regards to the brain, and also you have cofactors. The gut is producing huge amount of neurotransmitters. Most of your serotonergic system is actually in the gut, not the brain. About 95% of your serotonergics are in the gut, and the gut's a learning nervous system, so it reacts to food, it reacts to when you eat. The number one predictor of when you get hungry is when you ate past couple of days. The body learns very quickly, oh, it's time for dinner. And you know this if you have children or animals. They know 20 minutes before it's time for dinner what
Hmm.
time it is. They're looking at you crying. So uh, their circadian rhythm is very, very strong with regards to food, but the brain can pretty much adapt as much as it needs to. So humans can successfully eat every hour. Humans can successfully eat once every 2 days. So it's about the integration of the cues more than anything else. So my biggest takeaway on that is to avoid eating late, essentially, and you'll not get in the way. Also, there's some good advice around not eating first thing in the morning. When you first get up, cortisol has spiked to raise your blood sugar and your heart rate, your HRV, to wake you up. And you have for about an hour, hour or two, you've got high cortisol and somewhat high blood sugar relative to your baseline. And so, in that first hour after you get up, you probably shouldn't eat, shouldn't have coffee, because you have a very large amount of cortisol and blood sugar sort of occupying information flow. If you shove more cortisol and blood sugar right into your system first thing,
Hmm.
you may become sort of resistant to the signaling. So the cup of coffee is not going to have the same impact right when you wake up as it might 90 minutes after you get up. So I'm a big fan of a morning routine, of a minimal viable practice. Find the thing to do that doesn't feel like a burden, but feels like self-care, and build in a 20-minute routine of things that you don't skip. You hit the can, you brush your teeth, Maybe you go for your 5 sun salutations or your walk to that coffee shop in the corner that your wife loves the coffee from or something.
Mhm.
And you create a little practice that involves movement,
Mhm.
low-key movement you can talk over. I don't want you doing your CrossFit first thing in the morning or your 50-mile bike ride first thing in the morning. I'd rather you do your yoga, your walking, your stretching. And then your body's woken up, it's burned off the cortisol, burned off the blood sugar that woke you up. And now, when you receive more energy, more cortisol, the body will hear it very differently. And so it'll create more appropriate, if you will, timing cues for the brain and body.
Well, very interesting, and at least I guess different than most people live.
A little bit sometimes, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm as guilty. I wake up in the morning with too much blood in my caffeine stream. I stumble to the coffee machine and feed my cats while I'm making coffee. They know exactly what time of day it is then too. I'm convinced my cats think the coffee grinder means they get fed too, because
Mhm.
those two things tend to co-occur. So, your own brain may not know that getting up doesn't just mean shoving food and coffee into your mouth first thing. So if you teach yourself to have a little bit of an energy flux, to drop that cortisol, to drop the energy before you start taking more in, you may notice that you actually react to food and stimulants and things
Yeah,
very
sure.
differently.
Yeah,
So
reflected for sure. Um, you would say the brain can make decision or adapt, and you talked
yeah,
about
nearly infinitely. It's very adaptable.
that 90% of whatever information goes to the brain. What about the idea of a free will?
Ah,
If the brain
so
just,
easy low key questions on this discussion today. I see. Okay. Uh, Free will. I have a hard time even conceptualizing consciousness. So I'm
Mhm.
not sure. I mean, I think free will exists in the moment, just like being conscious, being aware exists in the moment. But I'm not sure that we have all that much free will because we are creatures of habit, learning, structure, socialized, constructivism. Our meaning is made by the relationships we have with each other, with our world, and our motivated behaviors, reducing the drives for thirst and hunger, et cetera, are big pieces. But the context we put the world in is dramatically different, I think, culturally and spiritually, person to person. So
well, is
I
this
think there's a
the
lot of
the
variability there.
question
Yeah.
of free will, or is it about awareness or possibilities to live it?
Free will is confusing from the point of view of the brain because if you look at what the brain is doing in response to the outside world, you can actually measure the brain reacting to the outside world before the mind knows about it.
Yes. This is a Libet experiment.
Yeah, there's so many experiments showing the brain has picked up information and has related to you before you're aware of it. This
Yeah.
happens everywhere, subtle things. And so I think that the conscious mind is not necessarily always in the decision seat. It's a bit late in the process. And so we tend to, this is, I think, the basis of things like intuition and other sort of non-cognitive awareness, maybe spirituality. It's this knowing that creeps in.
Mhm.
But free will is, would require the concept of free will would require the ability to make choice and cause things to happen from choice. The physics of the intersection of neuroscience and physics is very, very squirrely in terms of what's happening at the level of the neuron. Inside the neuron, we have microtubules, these little railway tracks that carry information, carry packets up and down the neuron. And there's some evidence that the microtubules operate at a spatial scale, a small enough scale that there may be quantum effects happening inside the microtubules. They're so small. Water may tunnel down in the same way that entangled molecules can be non-local, essentially. And if you look at some of the work of current physicists looking at this particular topic, they're a little bit convinced that um, there's not going to be any way mathematically to go from possibility to discrete information. That's a collapse of the quantum possibility, the foam into discrete information. There's a lot of very, very smart physicists saying that we're not going to be able to computationally arrive at a reduction from quantum possibility into discrete events. And if that's the case, then what our consciousness is is simply an awareness of the collapse of the possibility into the reality. It's knowing, it's that time course, that moment, that microsecond as things become real. That might be what consciousness is, simply our awareness of that thing happening as it's happening, sort of watching the marbles fall down the hill. And I think our awareness of that popping into, reality becoming reality, I think we've conflated that with an idea that we have a separate consciousness, a separate awareness from reality. So I'm a little bit convinced that, forget free will, the consciousness is a bit of an illusion. So that we do things like keep eating, having sex, and avoiding pain. And, it's really about the survival of the genetics, not so much about the individual. So I don't know that I really believe too much in consciousness, let alone free will, because I see cases where consciousness is easily abolished. Anesthesia, brain injuries, someone has a concussion and loses memory, and their identity is dramatically shifted. So I don't know how I feel about this idea of a free will. Well, you may have to get back to me on that one. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's as interesting. At least it's a topic I'm dealing with, yeah, quite intensively at the moment. And this is also the question: where's our memory or whatever? Or when we say in the quantum world theory is that the observer decides the
Yeah,
outcome.
the OOR, the orchestrated
So,
reality where things collapse.
so
Yeah.
what you say then is, oh no, the observer just had a different awareness that he could see the difference.
Yeah, that's my guess, is that what consciousness, the perspective we have of being aware, is
Mm-hmm.
simply observing reality coming into existence in
Mm-hmm.
sequential moments. And that awareness of the thing actually happening, of reality becoming real,
Mm-hmm.
we sort of believe we're somehow involved with,
Yeah.
because we're seeing things change at a ultra fine time scale. So I think that we believe that we have control over it, when most of what we experience, probably not that conscious, not that cognitive. It's more subcognitive. It's, deep learning and trauma and perspective. And then there's language, the language,
Mm-hmm.
impacts how you think, the Worfian,
Yeah, some body
right?
language and
So all of this is impacting what you see. And if your
yeah.
priors, if your perspective impacts what you believe, then free will is sort of constrained by all of those things and not a separate thing. It's only in response to what you believe, what you see, what you feel, the stimulus and response. And I don't know that there's an awful lot of choice involved with that. I think that
Mm-hmm.
the illusion of consciousness is useful, but I don't think it necessarily exists. Yeah.
Dalai Lama said, "Oh yes, I experience fear." And the question, how do you handle it? He says, I focus on intention. So it sounds like I make a free decision. Thich Nhat Hanh said, oh yes, I can have the feeling of rage, but I can control it. And no, I'm not one of these super guys, but I remember when I was younger and driving on the motorway and someone cut me, I reacted directly,
Mm.
was pissed off or whatever, oh, whatever, make alarm, lights. Today, maybe I feel a little bit the trigger, but most of the times I feel a kind of free space. How do I want to respond, not just react? So, what would you call this? Free will? Or
Well, I think you've learned that uh,
it feels better?
not just that, but something happened before you reacted to change what you thought about it. So maybe when you were in your 20s, you thought, oh, that asshole. And now
Mhm.
you're thinking, oh, that person's unskillful or something. So your perspective on the act that happened in the moment was not one that required a threat level of response. When you're in your
Mhm.
20s and someone cuts you off and you're angry, it's a threat response. You're in a crisis level response briefly. At least your brain is deciding maybe you better react strongly. But you also have a lot more, inhibitory tone. You're less reactive 20, 30, 40 years later than you were in your 20s. So I think that the conceptual landscape has changed, but also the hair trigger, the ability to pump the gas and brakes is more finely grained as we get
Mhm.
out of our 20s. So my hunch is you've transcended a little bit, and don't view the person who's cutting you off as a threat the same way, and therefore doesn't require the same reaction. But I would say that's somewhat informed by how you've changed more than how that person or that driver has interacted with you. And
Mhm.
so, your perspective on people cutting you off is no longer a survival level,
Yeah.
experience, is my guess.
Suddenly in my database are more possibilities than just one, and it needs time to figure out which one is it.
You've also been cut off 1,000 times since you were in your 20s.
Hmm.
So you've had this experience of non-crisis level consequence for
Yeah.
stressful events, which might recontextualize. This is sort of the basis of therapy, is you re-experience the
Hmm.
stressor, but in a container that is safe. And whenever we have memories or experiences, it's sort of like unremembering something, examining it, and re-remembering it. So if you move through stressful events, but move through them again and again mentally or in a practical environment like driving, then you'll get sort of re-educated. The context will get fixed, and it ceases to be this singular solo event, I would say.
What is a consequence out of this to say, I can't choose to be happy? I just didn't experience enough happiness yet.
Mm, maybe. Yeah. Um, Again, happiness is another one of these very complicated topics like free will.
Mhm.
Uh, and I don't know if I have a concept, a clear concept of happiness. There's the reduction of suffering with contentment and things like that. And then there's absorption states, I would say, which involve joy and love and, feeling for other people. But I think happiness is a construct that we sort of apply to a bunch of other more basic features around feeling safe,
Mhm.
feeling joy, feeling love, feeling um, fed, feeling, I almost think of happiness as or contentment as the inverse of stress. And stress is sort of feeling like you don't have the resources to meet the current demand. You feel overextended.
Yeah.
And I would argue that happiness, while not complete with this, requires that aspect of feeling like you are in the moment enough and you have enough and
Mhm.
you're being met appropriately and all your needs are met. And there's, I think that's an aspect of happiness, necessary but not sufficient for it, perhaps. And
So
just like when you were
Mhm.
driving your car, the secondary reaction, that is, Buddhist, the second dart, holding a coal in your hand so you can throw it at somebody else. It's the attachment to the secondary response. You have no choice over whether or not you stub your toe, but you do have a choice of whether or not you hop around yelling at your chair afterwards. So I
Mhm.
think as you evolve, as you develop, as you grow, you have figured out uh, how to have the context that is beyond simply the momentary reaction. So transcendence, evolution.
Where is for you then the difference when we can, maybe it's a kind of free will question. Um, I grow up maybe at home when there was stress or whatever, and my dad had only one tool, it was a hammer. So every problem was treated with a hammer.
Mm.
So I grew up with this. So it doesn't matter if it's stress in the relationship, is this a car, or someone cutting me off, or I had only the idea of using the hammer when I had kind of emotional stress. Now, growing older, I somehow collected or I got as a birthday present different tools. So now I have a lot of tools. Is this maybe just, oh, I don't know which tool to use now? So, or is it, no, I really decide which tool to use?
It's a great question. My hunch is it's both. Uh,
Mhm.
that you have additional tools, and therefore, I mean, if you only have the one reaction, if your dad is always yelling, and you're out in the world and somebody creates conflict, given your skills, given what you've been taught, given what you modeled, you're going to yell, you're going to create, anger. But I think we also, we have ridiculously rich lives, even those of us that are suffering and in, crises a lot of the time. It's not all that all the time. And so
Mhm.
in our teen years, we develop a separation of identity. This is why we get rebellious at 13, 14, 15 and start, wearing leather jackets and smoking if it was the 60s and doing, these days it's random music or something. I don't know. But that's an identity development aspect as you pull away from the little tribe you grew up in and develop a secondary identity. It's evolutionarily beneficial. So you can go mix your genes with a different group of people, essentially. But my hunch is there's secondary development that comes. I taught college for a long time at UCLA, and there's an awful lot of difference between an 18 and 19-year-old freshman
Mhm.
and a 23-year-old senior. I mean, dramatic sometimes, like children versus real adults sometimes. And a lot of variability on the average 18-year-old
Age
comes in too.
thing, or is this just
It,
culture or whatever?
it's cultural, and you'll see differences across different cultures. You get three 18-year-olds coming into the university,
Mhm.
and one person has been taken really good care of, has all the resources, and doesn't necessarily have a lot of internal
Mhm.
ability to structure time, to meet commitments, because things have been taken care of for this is the first time they're having to like bring an assignment in or remember things or write things down. And other folks, they come in at 19 or 20 and they've been working full time for 10 years. They got a kid, they're responsible for their grandmother. That's a very different student who's engaged with a fully adult life in their
Mhm.
late teens versus somebody who's maybe starting the adult life. And I mean, this is the if you get the big five, the ocean model or canoe model for personality, the theory is that we have these resources, these aspects of ourselves that are somewhat built in. And they do change throughout the life course, but they really change based on the demands that we have to meet, the responsibilities, the job, the family, the life. And beyond that, our tendency to have a certain amount of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism, these things are somewhat built in and they react to the demands, responsibilities, the role of life you put yourself in. So I think that is actually, again, it's not so much about free will. It's like if you got a kid you got to take care of and they're crying, you react to it and you do it. So, yeah.
In this a big difference for the modern world? And if you go a few thousand years back, Alexander the Great, he was with 21, not in a university. He didn't have a nice life, but he was already conquering
Yeah.
and what do you say, countries, big army, and whatever they needed to think.
Yeah.
Um, and they had all expected a different lifespan. So there's these native people that with 13 boys go whatever for tests and then they're already adults.
Mhm.
So is this really, so what dictates the brain or this life of responsibility creates a brain or a remodels?
Yeah. There's developmental stuff, there's developmental stages that we have to get
Mhm.
through. But the last big ones are really in the mid-teen years. This is probably why culturally a lot of cultures have adulthood, or, rituals of adulthood starting at 13 or so, is
Mhm.
because that's really when the brain has turned into the adult brain.
Mhm.
From the ages 8 to 10, roughly 9 to 11
Mhm.
for boys, 8 to 10 for girls. The brain finishes its child to adult development in terms of left right hemispheres separating, language locking down on one side, and a bunch of other phenomena really become more of the adult pattern as you hit that stage of age. I think this is why we have 13 years as the sort of age of
Mhm.
spiritual adulthood, or in some ways the next stage of life in many cultures. And then up until the mid 20s, the brain is developing more and more self control. So in a Western, if you will, these college students you mentioned, they're finishing college with a finally with a brain that's finished cooking as they reach their mid 20s. But I do think that we have the ability to be fully formed adults largely, in our late teens, early 20s. And as you say, some historically over the past thousands of years, very common to be an adult and to do adult things and big challenges when you are younger than maybe modern adulthood is.
Mhm.
But I read an article yesterday. Some 13-year-old just graduated from MIT with a PhD. I mean, it still happens that you have these overachievers. And if you look at the literature on productivity and expertise, what you
Mhm.
find is that if you look across different aspects of human excellence, be it music and science or math or politics or writing or art, is that you get this time window that happens and people become good at things after they do them for a certain amount of time. It's not about the age of the individual, it's about the career age, the
Is
amount of
this
time you have
10,000 hour idea?
I'm sorry?
Is this the 10,000 hours idea? You need to do something?
It is, although Gladwell would hate that because everyone misunderstands his ideas. But no, it just takes time to there's a generativity and a productivity aspect. You can't get the good art out until you've gotten the bad art out of the way.
Mhm.
Also, there's the practical techniques. If you practice your art, you get better at your art. So certain careers require longer to master, and certain careers and abilities benefit from things you have more strongly when you're young.
Mhm.
So if you're a statesperson or a writer, you tend to be older when you reach the peak of your career because it takes 30 years of being a statesperson to become the best writer and politician or something. But
Mhm.
if you're somebody who's building sculpture, then you're probably 30 when you hit your peak because it requires a lot of physicality. It's a physical thing. And maybe you're not a different you haven't developed the expertise in the fine subtle things, but you have the mechanical at that point. So you can look at career age instead of chronological age as a predictor for the maximal output, the highest quality output. And this is true across Mozart and sculptors and Churchill. This is very, very classic curve that shows up, but it's a career age curve, not a chronological. So my guess is Alexander the Great started conquering at age 12. And this is why he was, conquered half the world by his late teens or something, is he started early.
Mhm.
And you'll find, in our, I would say our American Western culture, childhood is extended and adolescence is prolonged. And
But there is a kind
sometimes those, yeah,
same way. I just read from Buffett. Warren Buffett said also, so what people do between 13 and 18, 20, if they have a focus already, they are maybe have it the whole life and are good at it. Because
maybe,
especially
maybe,
some programming, and in America, there is an insurance company to hire a new salesperson. They ask, what did you do at 12? So when did you start to earn the first money? Is there something in programming?
maybe I think certainly we can become good at anything
Yes, right.
early, much earlier than we do now. I mean, apprenticeships historically in the past 10,000 years was how things were taught. And you started apprenticing as you're a blacksmith or a leather worker or a haberdasher. You started apprenticing, at that same young teenage because that was when you were moving into your career. And
Hmm.
I think we can still do that these days. Often we do, but culturally, I think that's very bound, one place to the next. And it's probably a little unusual even here in the US for people to be hiring salespeople, asking them, what they did in their pre-college days. But I think it is a cultural aspect and we are, both underutilizing humans, but also giving ourselves, we're sort of like in this renaissance of we have freedom, we have time,
Hmm.
the medicine, the food access, the money. We are a richer people worldwide, even given all the nonsense that's happening and all the starvation and war that's happening. As a human species, we are the richest, the most educated, the healthiest that we've ever been.
Hmm.
And I think that's just going to continue. And we're sort of now in this maybe last vestiges of the previous couple thousand years of stratified society and inequality and wars. So I'm hoping that all of this evolution ends up where we are able to have more freedom, more ability to grow slowly if we need to develop our careers young if we want to. But right now, we still take people at age, 8 or so, put them in a school system, and then move them through 10 or 20 years of school. And even in the US, that's starting to get a little bit of a pushback. When I was young in the 70s and 80s, there were trade schools that were a very viable thing to do. You might go become a mechanic or a plumber or electrician, and those still exist. But the idea of non-bachelor's level schools, non-college programs being as good or maybe better, that's just starting to come back up, I think, culturally here in the US as a viable thing because
Mm.
colleges are insanely expensive and they've gone up so much. And also, I mean, talking about Buffett, Buffett's really old. And while he may have had an awful lot of ideas that are valid 20 years ago, I'm not that impressed with Buffett talking about the young people because their ability to afford a house, to get a job that covers more than basic needs, it has never been worse in the past 100 years in this country. So young people are in a very different environmental and economic environment than Buffett was or anyone else was who's born after or born before the 1980s, basically. So I think the economic environment is less good for almost everyone who's young now, probably than it's been in a long time. And I think that'll change as we, develop more technology and more, again, more freedoms. It's a freedom. It's a largesse. It's a luxury that we can enter college at age 17 and exit at age 22, and spend a bunch of years learning stuff and getting developed. And it's incredibly wonderful. And we may turn that into our, medical degree or our poetry or whatever. But it's also a different place in terms of
It's
freedom
a
and
different
ability.
place. And it comes out to the brain. What do we learn? How we program the brain? Because we are school system, and like I can see it in Europe,
Yeah.
is education for jobs which not existing anymore. Yeah.
Mm.
And then, yeah, you end up in poverty. It's just
Yep.
it's still for kind of factory conveyor belt or whatever old
Yep.
thinking.
Even at a high level, even the top edge of education, like a PhD or something in the US, a PhD they're usually 5-year programs. The
Mm-hmm.
average length of finishing, completion for a PhD student is 8.5 years in the
Mm-hmm.
US. But you go to Europe and get a PhD, and it's a specific job you have for 2 to 3 years. It's a contract, it's one project, it's paid to do one set of research, and you go in with having already usually developed a master's or some data skills.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very narrow, prescribed with an endpoint. But in the U.S., you end up spending years in getting your education and then years not finishing generally.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's a cultural difference. So I have a lot of clients, a lot of friends in Europe are like, oh, I'm thinking of getting a PhD in the US. And I'm like, why would you do that? It's incredibly expensive and it takes so much time, and the systems are not set up to move you through the program. So you have to be completely self-driven. But if you go get a PhD job in Europe, okay, 2.5 years later, you have your PhD and you've been paid for that work generally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a much better model. And I think that, for education anyways, just like our undergraduate lack of maybe skill bearing education is starting to be questioned. I have a hunch that, well, we're already seeing in the US, we're seeing different ways of funding grad students and different ways of trying to make it more equal. I went to grad school and my advisor didn't have a lot of funding. So I spent my whole time, teaching and doing other jobs. A couple friends whose advisors were heavily funded and they finished in 3.5 years, never doing a job and, just working in the lab.
Mm-hmm.
So that piece of it, the higher education piece of it, is being sort of refactored, I think. But
The times
uh,
are changing really
yeah,
rapidly. Now you can ask
and
the
information's
ChatGPT a
accessible,
lot
right?
and get more
Sorry.
information, huh? The modern technology. So what's changing in the brain? Or maybe before, another question in my book, Better the Whole World Against Me Than My Soul, I
Mm,
mentioned a discussion with a German professor who we call him a kind of brain pope or whatever in Germany. um, and asked him, where's the memory? And he said, it's in the brain.
Right.
And
Maybe it might be. We're not sure.
might be, but he said he was quite sure because, and you mentioned also damages in brain, and then they don't remember.
Hmm?
But that really is not convincing me because if my computer, I take something out, I can't access the cloud anymore.
But
So,
but not true in the brain. Carl Lashley, one of the first brain scientists looking at memory, taught mice and rats to run mazes, and
mhm,
then progressively remove more and more of their cortex to try to abolish the memory, looking for where memory is. Couldn't find it. Was able to remove, many parts of the brain and never abolish memory. And
mhm,
now we sort of know, it's not well understood, but we know that the hippocampal structures that both retrieve memory and store memory, they're storing it in a distributed way. There's several different ways we know that memory occurs. We're getting hints of it. We don't know overarching, but we know that the pattern of where receptors used to be. So neurons will create receptors and pull them back and make them more sensitive, make them less sensitive. But the pattern of the holes in the membranes of where receptors used to be is one of the memory encodings. So is the weight between different neurons, how likely they are to fire if one fires and the other one gets the firing. But it looks like the information might not be stored discretely. So it's kind of like you had a song that you wanted to remember. Instead of remembering that particular series of notes, you might remember the mathematical arrangement of that song, the algorithm of that song. But that math might be stored through the unique conformation, the unique connection of several different neurons as a pattern. And that pattern might actually not be in one place, but be
mhm.
sort of resonant through multiple cells. So this is called holographic memory, the idea that we can store patterns that are evocative of the information we wish to learn, but the patterns aren't stored in a particular place. They're stored as this recurrent echo of information in a sort of fractal holographic um, algorithm that is stored in. Again, we don't know, it's not in a particular place, but it appears to be essentially distributed, redundant storage all throughout the cortex. So thoroughly redundant that if you lose aspects of, or you lose physical tissue, you don't lose individual memories. You might lose resources, language or production, but you generally lose memory if you lose part of your brain, which is kind of cool.
It's also if you have this organ transplant, or especially also with the heart, that the person says, "Oh no, I feel different. I have memories. I can't really."
Absolutely. There's some evidence that we store memories in non-brain tissue.
Mhm,
It's kind of crazy, but there's case study after case study of heart transplants waking up and dialing the phone number of their heart transplant donor,
mhm,
or craving cigarettes when they don't smoke cigarettes, or tearing up when they hear the sound of a kid's voice and not knowing why, realizing it's the kid of the heart donor. So the heart might be special. I'm not sure if we've seen this hint of transferred memories in other organ transplants. The heart's really special. It has neurons that are somewhat similar to the brain neurons, but they regulate differently. If you probably all seen an EKG, that sort of classic waveform, and an EKG is the same every time. It's a coherent wave, and based on shape changes in that wave, you can kind of tell what's happening in the heart. The timing is off, or there's a skip beat or whatever. But the brain is not coherent like that. Very similar neurons, but they're chaotic and they're oscillatory. They're quite a lot going on. If you look at a brainwave, look at an EEG, and you see a heartbeat type form, a coherent high amplitude waveform, that's a seizure. And if you look at the heart and you see the chaotic oscillation the way you would see in the brain, that's a heart attack. So you have this regulatory domain stability. The heart wants to remain coherent, the brain wants to remain chaotic. And if they flip into the other regulation mode, that's where illness is.
mhm,
So I do believe the heart, because it's similar neurons, likely has the ability to store information. I mean, we know the heart will develop responses to our stress level, to our gut, to our brain. So it seems like a very small leap. We don't know scientifically how this works, but a very small leap to suggest that the heart itself may be a repository of information. Certainly poets would agree, but I'm not sure that neuroscientists have any real good answers yet. So
I don't know. I can only speculate. I studied law, so totally different. But when I look at my radio, there are different stations and they have different frequencies. If I am on one frequency, I can't hear the other one, but
mm,
it's there, still in the air. So when you have an organ transplant, so the donor maybe was on a totally different frequency. And so the different frequencies coming together. And then now is a question what I'm listening to.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting. There's something there we don't yet know, but
Yeah.
it's
Because
nice that there's still things we don't know.
like we had the topic before, you need to train over 10,000 hours or what kind of
Mm,
concept.
mm.
I met once Bert Goldman. He was, yeah, kind of, I would call it also spiritual trainer and everything. And he took from, and I see in the science world, do have one universe as a meta or the parallel universes. And so he believed there are parallel. And you have a doppelganger and you can be in this universe, this one and this one. So he decided to be a photographer, a rock singer, a painter, and somehow immediately he was good because
Mm.
he was so good in tuning in. So where did this ability or possibility came from?
I mean, we carry around so many limiting beliefs. We could do almost anything if we thought we could.
Mm-hmm.
Literally. I mean, the ability of the human brain and body to perform in ways we don't expect is there. You know,
So that
in,
is
in
maybe a good now finally come to peak Brain Institute topic. So what is it really about? I can read about, okay, it's about healing. Is this just more about healing or tuning? Okay, we can learn more. But it's just a huge variety of possibilities there.
it is, and it's nearly infinite what you can do with your brain. The way that I approach this sort of functionally is I think about the resources that might scaffold your goals, or I think about the suffering that's there that you might want to get rid of. And there's a handful of things in the brain, about 6 or 8 things that you can consider regulatory. These are features that are sort of meant to change,
Mm-hmm.
and they rise to the level of challenge and demand that you give them largely. And they're meant to be resilient, but they also kind of cramp up and dysregulate. And that's where we get a lot of the human suffering. And these are, to rattle them off, these are things like attention, all the anxiety flavored things, sleep, speed of processing, stability, so seizure and migraine resistance, and sensory work and social processing. These are all somewhat regulatory. So your sleep, your executive function, your stress are not fixed things. There's a handful of resources in the cortex that you can see. You can actually measure them and look at them, but you can change them. So if you meditate or do neurofeedback or change your B vitamins from methylation or 1,000 other things, you can literally change how these resources work because they're meant to adjust lifelong. So those are things that I think that we often don't understand individually and we don't think they can change. So we tend to, as humans, have this suffering where we think we have a diagnosis or we think we have a challenge or a problem, and it's happening to us. It is how things are, but that's not usually true. You know, if you have severe PTSD or anxiety or ADHD or something, well, you can look at your brain and you can see these features jumping out as actual structural and functional resources. And once you know how they work, you can change them.
Mm-hmm.
So the brain is not as mysterious as people often think when they have depression, anxiety, seizures, migraines, lack of fulfillment, lack of joy, creativity. These are things you can learn how they work, just like you learn how your blood species work. If you do a blood panel and you see your triglycerides are extremely high, back off on the ice cream, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with your brain. If you look at your brain and the alpha speed is dragging down really slow, and you're having word finding issues and delayed recall and tip of the tongue kind of phenomena, well, okay. That's it. It's right there. It's the alpha speed. Let's look and see, is it your delta? Maybe your sleep isn't great. Is it your beta? Maybe anxiety is slowing down your processing. So you can actually tease apart the functional limits in executive function, stress, and sleep, especially. And then you can exercise these resources once you know what you're going after and create really quick change. And things like ADHD or anxiety, we usually work with folks for 3 or 4 months. And in that time frame, they make on a bell curve multiple standard deviations of change, permanent change in
Mhm.
big features of executive function, sleep, anxiety. So the brain is dramatically more changeable than we realize. And many of us don't know how to apply the pressure and steer for those changes. But once you do, whether or not it's watching the aura ring and changing behavior to get better sleep, or going after and sticking wires on your head and training the brain directly, and everything in between, the brain's incredibly malleable and the resources are not that fixed. Only about a third or less of your experience is genetic in the brain. Most of it's actually learning and
Mhm.
can be changed. So, shift happens. Get yours. Get some change if you want it.
Yeah, if you said the Oura ring or whatever, well, my understanding is was that we had for a long time also a different idea about the brain because we had not the computers, the possibilities to measure. So just recently we can get the information and see the possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't look at cholesterol 100 years ago. We didn't look at bone density 20 years ago. Sleep quality is a thing we're just now starting to figure out. But we have the access. We're able to sample our blood panels, our sleep quality, our brain waves. And again, once you know how these things work, it puts you in the driver's seat because you can then decide to take control over it.
Yeah. So in the end, it's in the driver's seat, not just for brain, it's just for the whole quality of life, being, solving problems. So it's not only fixing the car, it's just really also tuning into the optimum, if you like. So everything is possible.
Not
And
just possible, but once you see it, once you see your suffering, your anxiety, your ADHD, your sleep issues, once you see it in data, in a brain map,
Mhm.
in some performance testing, it hasn't changed your suffering the next moment, but it's much harder to be overwhelmed or ashamed or feel guilty about your anxiety when you're looking at it in
Yeah.
data and saying, oh, here's an adaptation of your brain. Oh, okay. Yeah, I feel that. Well, it's not really your fault. You aren't mad at your shoulder on a broken on an X-ray. It's
Hmm.
real. You're frustrated. The pain's there, but you don't feel guilty about your broken shoulder.
Yeah. Like you
And
say,
we do feel guilty.
you can't maybe not get rid of the pain, but you can get rid of the suffering. So
Yeah.
your perception about it. Hmm.
But when it comes to the brain, we don't know what's going on. We think it's
Hmm.
our fault. We think it's happening to us. We don't understand how it's working. We may have a diagnostic label applied to us. And I think that can obscure really quite powerfully the potential of taking control because it's now top down applied from the outside instead of knowing how these individual resources might work for you. So I know thyself is incredibly important, and the brain is knowable much more than we think often.
Yeah.
So
And is there some kind of age limit? I grew up as what you don't learn when you're young, you never can
yeah,
learn again if you're old or whatever. Or is this,
no, there's no age limit is the short answer. When I was in college, or actually before between undergrad and grad school, I took about a decade off, and in that decade is when we discovered that we don't stop making neurons. I mean,
hmm.
you right now, sir, are making in the neighborhood of 700 neurons a day.
Hmm.
So you're still making them lifelong, and those neurons can resort and reconnect nearly infinitely. So you're never going to not have enough brain tissue. It's not really an issue. You can never stop learning. The brain has an infinite capacity as far as we're concerned to reorganize. So it's never really a limit of the resources. It might be of how you're using them or how they're tuned. If you can't concentrate or can't sleep or can't remain calm, it may be hard to function in the way you wish. But the brain is largely uh, unlimited in terms of its ability, and I think we're starting to figure that out. I mean, my grandparents and great grandparents were much older than my parents are at the same age,
Hmm.
physically, emotionally, stage of life. My mom, who's 75, is, traipsing around the world, traveling, cataloging random animals, stomping through jungles, having fun. And her grandmother was frail at 75 and mostly sat at home and didn't have that same kind of like conquer the world, I'm still young kind of perspective. And some of that's because of the medicine and the health and the perspective. And some of it's because, we have a different perspective on being in our 60s and 70s and 80s now than we had 100 years ago, so.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Like this is cut off. I learned not to be stressed.
Mm.
Uh, when I got older, I got stressed because I couldn't do things. And that's also interesting. And I'm realizing also shifting, at least with the mindset. When I was very little and couldn't really walk, I kept on trying because maybe I had the belief one day I can walk like the adults. But then I was so programmed over decades. From now on, the doctor says, yeah, you're getting old, you need to live a bit and everything. So when I got problems and my leg not walking right, I
Mm.
and had not in the beginning the idea it will be better. Hopefully I can keep it a while like that.
Mm.
Hopefully it's not getting worse. Yeah.
Because of what a doctor said, because this
Yes.
perspective of, yeah.
Yeah. And then I shifted, and now I'm getting older and I'm getting fitter again. So what if I go in the studio in the institute and we trained? What do you think? What we said also we are not really living our potential. What do you see is possible? So far you can see as you,
Yeah.
or now I want to prepare. I just last week I turned 72, so
Happy
um,
birthday.
I have 28 years to 100. So how could I be? Like if we go in the blue zone in Netflix, there is a 100 year
Yeah.
old South American cowboy every day on the horse. I never was that fit like he is with 100. So okay, I can say he trained longer, but um, so what is possible?
Yeah. So the blue zones are interesting. There's something there, but it's a little bit of a confirmation bias too. So we should be cautious reading too much into blue zones unless we see the same behavior also supporting health in individuals that are not in those areas, because there's a lot of noisy data, so to speak. But we do know nowadays that there are ways to remain relatively healthy and or to get healthier. There's this idea of compression of morbidity. You don't want to age and die for 30 years. You want to squeeze all your illness and death into the last 10 seconds of life
Mhm.
and slide into that parking space and fall over dead last minute if you can, living powerfully up until that moment.
Mhm.
Compression of morbidity, moving illness into the later part of life. And we're doing that now. We age slower in our 60s and 70s now than we did 100 years ago. But there are things you can do to take fairly aggressive control and to not just flatten the trajectory, but to improve the trajectory. One of the biggest things is meditation. Lifelong meditation will sidestep the age-related cognitive thinning, the cortical thinning rather, that you experience starting in your 30s. You get a little loss of cortex every year, and it starts to accelerate in our 60s with a few percentage of the weight of our cortex, unless you meditate. And it doesn't seem to take much. 20 minutes a day probably will sidestep the meditation. And if you do it lifelong, the
Mhm.
amount your cortex is still thick, the amount you sidestep cortical thinning, is correlated with your lifelong meditation hours.
What is meditation for you? Does it never have a headset and relaxing music, or is it?
No, meditation is just anchoring. It's executive function. It's anchoring the focus. To quote John Kabat-Zinn, meditation or mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way on purpose to the present moment. And I would
Mhm.
add, with curiosity or a sense of investigation instead of a sense of judgment.
Mhm.
But it's anchoring, it's paying attention in a particular way. That's all
Mhm.
meditation is. And then noticing when you've gotten distracted and going back to the same anchor, the same focus again and again and again. That's the rep of meditation, of the exercise. People
Yes.
often think meditation is being relaxed.
Mhm.
No, you don't be strong at the gym, you be weak Later on, you're strong because you worked out the resource. And meditation is frustrating, it's distracting, it's annoying. You sit there and focus again and again and again and again and again. But if you keep doing it, you develop a lot more cognitive and cortical power. And then the moments when you're not on the cushion, you have more of an inhibitory tone, a spaciousness, less of a reactivity. Because you have better executive function, you're less reactive. You're less likely to yell at the guy who cut you off because you have that moment of inhibitory tone, the moment to decide, perhaps. So maybe there's your free will. We create space
Oh, good.
in
Would you
the
call it
decision action.
higher level of resilience?
You do have a higher level of resilience with meditation as well. Yeah, you develop less. There's a positivity bias that creeps in, so we stop viewing things as negative or threatening. This also happens with aging, called gerotranscendence, whether or not you meditate or not. As you hit your 60s and 70s, you start developing spiritual experiences and a view on life as transcendent of your suffering. It's a very common phenomenon. We don't know why it happens. It's not just spiritual. It's not because you're reaching a later part of your life. It seems to be this shift that happens where we care about things differently. So yeah, don't know.
Back to Peak Institute. So
yeah,
what is the reason? Which is, why should they go? Who is your client, or your wished dream client?
Yeah, so we only work with folks that have brains. That's our one client type, is those that have a brain. An awful lot of our clients have difficulty with executive function, sleep, stress. In the sort of low-hanging fruit for neurofeedback, which is the primary technique we use, things like ADHD, anxiety, seizure, migraine, PTSD, these are exceptionally tractable phenomena. You can change these things really, really quickly. So if you gave me, a never-ending stream of anxious, gifted people with ADHD, I'd be extremely happy, because within about 3 months, they would all not have ADHD in the classroom or the boardroom, only on the sport pitch or when they decided to be in a high stimulus environment. So you can reliably change almost every aspect of anxiety and attention, usually sleep. You can drop seizures back, the literature says, by 50%, but I've never seen a result as poor as 50%. It's always much more dramatic in terms of reduction of seizure. You can do creativity work, reliable work on creativity, access consciousness, flow state. If you're shut down, you can't feel your emotions, you can't talk about things, you can't be creative, reliably in a handful of neurofeedback sessions, you can pry open that door. And the moment when you're falling asleep and you have that burst of insight, or remember that thing you should do, or solve world hunger, and then you fall asleep and it's gone. That's the hypnagogic access state, where the monkey mind's dropped away and the receptive attention and awareness has come up. And you can train your brain to get reliable access to that in a handful of neurofeedback sessions, so that you can decide to go into that nonlinear access place simply by putting yourself in a state. And for people that are either working through trauma or trying to become more creative or more in touch with their emotions, this kind of creativity work is really powerful. And the same work, I'm not exactly sure why, but the same work we do for creativity, we also do for alcohol. So those folks that have been drinking for 20 years and are shaky and can't fall asleep and are nervous, even in the absence of alcohol, the brain gets sort of damaged by the constant glutamatergic. GABA is released by alcohol, and glutamate has to come up to match the GABA. But in the absence of alcohol, you're left with the shaky brain. The brain can't bring down the glutamate again. But in 6-10 weeks of neurofeedback, you take somebody who's been a lifelong craver of alcohol and dysregulated, and they're not craving, and fall asleep at will, they can be calm if they wish, in just a handful of weeks. So this is the promise of neurofeedback. If your brain is not doing what you want, especially in anxiety, attention, sleep, you can see it on a QEEG, a brain map, where you put a cap in the head, squirt it full of gel, and just grab some resting data. And if you see things in a brain map, you can then exercise the brain waves using biofeedback and make iterative and progressive change, a lot of change in just a few months. So we usually eliminate ADHD and really knock anxiety back to typical levels or pull the teeth of PTSD completely or OCD completely in a couple months. And
Yeah.
these are often folks who have been working with these challenges for
Years.
decades with no real success. And you get in there and exercise some brain waves, and you see people soar when their resources are not in their way anymore. So I worked in traditional mental health for many years, and doing neurofeedback still, even a dozen, 20 years plus into doing neurofeedback, it still feels like cheating a little bit because people just start changing so quickly. Within a handful of sessions, 3 or 4 sessions, you feel neurofeedback. So
If
it's
you
not
look at
this,
the sessions, what I understood also when you said you put something on your head,
yeah.
it's important to come to an institute. You need to go there physically. You can't do it via Zoom. So the best is.
We actually do it remotely. Yeah. We have physical offices. There's 2 in Europe. Well, we have Stockholm and London. Also got a handful in the US. There's about 4 or 5 in the US. But most of our clients, certainly in the US, never visit our offices.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe and the UK, people visit the office for the assessment, the brain mapping. But
Mm-hmm.
then they grab equipment and go home. I have a little device here. Here's an example of an EEG, a little micro EEG amplifier.
Mm-hmm.
And you just put a couple ear clips on and a couple wires on your head and measure the brain in real time. So the training process, the neurofeedback process, doesn't require a whole big rig of wires. You can just do it with a couple wires at a time. You measure the brain in real time. For instance, there's a circuit on the right hand side of the brain that knows if you're paying attention or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's involved with executive function, and it uses beta waves to do its job, and it goes into more automatic modes using theta waves. And so if you have tons of theta there, then you don't fall asleep really well, and you're also very distractible or impulsive. Squirrel, kind of ADHD type phenomena. It's this right hand side. So you simply stick a wire there plus some ear clips, and you measure the beta moment to moment, measure the theta as it changes moment to moment. Whenever the brain briefly moves in the right direction for half a second, you applaud the brain with auditory and visual feedback. And the brain says, oh, stuff. I like stuff. And then it moves in the wrong direction. The beta goes down, theta comes up, and the game slows down or stops. And the
Mm-hmm.
brain says, hey, I don't like no stuff. And then it happens to move in the right direction. The applause continues. And the brain starts to notice this. And the big trick is we move the goalposts. Every few seconds, we adjust the computer next to where the brain is. So the applause only occurs for that one little circuit flexing itself in the right direction. And you can't feel your brain waves. So this is mostly involuntary. You're watching a Pac-Man stop and start or cars move, and you're like, really? This is doing something? Really? But 2 sessions in, 3 sessions in, your brain's like, oh, you want some more beta? Here. And you're like, oh, wait a minute. I think I'm feeling something. I feel kind of focused. That's kind of weird. And then it wears off, and I must have imagined it. But the next time, it's stronger. And then it stops wearing off as you repeat it. So you have this opportunity, kind of like a personal training environment, to stretch a resource, feel it, grade it, then iterate. And we move people through 3 or 4 workouts a week, send equipment home. We have live coaches on 7 days a week. So it doesn't really matter if you're in Austria, Germany, Sweden, the UK, the US. Got to get some equipment. And then the coaches can work with you virtually, teaching you to run the workout gear. It's kind of like being in a high-end gym and having some goals, but not knowing how the machine is set up. And somebody
Mm-hmm.
sees your confusion, runs over and helps you set the machine up. So it's kind of, this is our model, like the soul cycle model for brain, where we send equipment home and there's little coaches in a window cheering you on and helping you, get things done. So
Sounds
it's,
wonderful.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
But anyway, it still can make sense to come to the institute because I'm planning now in around a month I will be in London.
Yeah,
Um,
we'll grab a copy of your brain data, show you your brain.
but it sounds very interesting, and at least for most people will be the solution is doing it from home. It's incredible. Hmm.
Yeah, and take some time too. Neurofeedback takes 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 sessions sometimes to get people where they want to go. So it's not a lot of time. You
Hmm.
work out for half an hour, 3 or 4 times a week, but you got to build up, 30, 40 sessions. So it takes a few months to really create the change you're looking for.
Yeah,
So,
but it's nothing compared what you can achieve. If
and you're actually creating change. You're not just being palliative or medicating a system. You're creating changes, strong changes in anxiety or ADHD, for instance, that are
I think
hard
it's
to ignore. Yeah.
still fast, really
It
fast.
is. Yeah. It's compared to most things. Again, I've been in this field for more than 20 years, and I forget sometimes how rapid it is compared to medication route sometimes, or psychotherapy, which can take a lot longer. And there's things we can do that you cannot do with meds or therapy.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't
I mean, the
drop seizures.
coaching world, and for a while, or even if you say consulting entrepreneurs, it's partly so hard to change them because they're always distracted. Here comes something
Yep.
else,
Yep.
and 3, 4 months, a big change. That is incredible.
And if
Mm.
you get the brain out of the way, all
Yeah,
the cognitive coaching takes off. If you get, people's psychotherapy, their coaching, their sport, their language, their relationships become amazing because the brain is no longer in the way.
yeah.
So therapists love sending people to us because we help
Mm.
the brain regulate, and then the therapy works or the coaching works or whatever else. So
Very interesting. So people who are really interested in this, changing their life fast with this, getting all whatever
mm.
um, stupid stuff, wrong programming, or even traumas, like I understood, out of the way. Mm, where to go? Just
Ah,
the website.
yeah, Peak Brain Institute or peakbrain.co.uk if you're in the
Hmm.
UK.
Hmm.
And check us out. I think most of our socials are Peak Brain LA because that was our first
Hmm.
office. But yeah, come check us out. If you're in one of the countries we're at, you can come get a local brain map. If you're not in one of those countries, we still do work in Canada and Australia, Dubai, but people generally get their own set of hardware and software. So it tends to be a little bit more of an investment because we have to get your own systems. But no, you can work with Peak Brain Institute wherever you happen to be. So come check us out on online and ask me your brain questions. I would love to see the kinds of things you're struggling with. So come tell us your brain stuff.
Yeah. I wrote a book with the title "The Best Is Yet to Come." So the best is yet to create.
Indeed, indeed,
Change your
that's great.
brain and then live the best life you ever lived. Thank
Sounds
you,
wonderful.
Andrew, for the time. I wish you a wonderful day in California, LA, and thank you for sharing. And at least I will meet your Peak Institute in London, and maybe we connect later and I share my experience with you. And
Wonderful.
whoever is listening or watching, really give it a try. You only can win.
Well, thank you, sir, for the kind words. I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you, Andrew.